In the depths of the Great Depression, when the world seemed to be falling apart, there was a tiny town that refused to die. Its name was Wörgl, a small place hidden in the Austrian Alps, where the streets had fallen silent, businesses shuttered their doors, and hunger had become part of daily life. By 1932, the global financial system had collapsed. Banks were failing, people had lost their savings, and governments seemed powerless to stop the downward spiral. Across Europe, and even in America, despair spread faster than any disease. But in this forgotten corner of Austria, a man named Michael Unterguggenberger, the town's humble mayor, was about to do something extraordinary. He was not an economist, not a politician trained in the capital, but a simple railway worker who understood one thing deeply: his people were suffering. Not because they lacked work, but because they lacked money. Factories sat idle, not because workers refused to work, but because there was no currency left to pay them. The problem wasn't laziness or lack of resources. The problem was that money, the lifeblood of any economy, had stopped moving. To understand what Michael did, we must understand what money really is. Money, at its core, is trust, a shared agreement that one piece of paper represents effort, value, and promise. But when fear grips a society, people stop spending, stop lending, and stop trusting. The economy freezes, and the very thing meant to connect people begins to divide them. Michael saw this happening to his town. He watched as able-bodied men stood by uselessly, while the streets crumbled, bridges decayed, and the unemployed filled soup lines. He realized something simple but profound. The town didn't lack work, it lacked circulation. He began reading about an unconventional idea by an economist named Silvio Gesell, who proposed something radical. What if money lost value the longer it was held? Just like food that spoils or metal that rusts, this kind of money would have to be used quickly or become worthless. It was designed to move, to flow, to keep the economic blood pumping. Most economists laughed at the concept, but to Michael it was worth trying. After all, traditional economics had already failed them. So in July of 1932, with unemployment at record highs and despair hanging over the town, the mayor gathered his council. He proposed printing a new local currency, but not ordinary money. These bills would require a monthly stamp to remain valid. Each stamp cost 1% of the bill's value. If you didn't buy and stick the stamp on time, the note expired. In other words, if you hoarded money, it would lose its worth. But if you spent it, it kept its power. The council was divided. Some called the idea foolish, even dangerous. Others warned that the government might shut them down. But desperation often makes room for courage. Eventually, they agreed to give it a chance. So the people of Wörgl printed 12,000 local notes, each backed by the same amount of Austrian shillings kept safely in a bank. It was not fake money. It was a promise that could be exchanged for real currency at any time. But here's the catch. The townspeople began using only their own money, not the national one. At first, it felt strange, even risky. But soon, something magical happened. The mayor hired unemployed workers to rebuild the town's roads and bridges, paying them in the new stamp scrip. Those workers immediately spent their earnings at local bakeries, shops, and markets, because holding on to the money would cost them more each month. The shopkeepers, in turn, used it to pay their taxes or buy supplies. The money began to move faster and faster, circulating dozens of times where the old currency had stopped entirely. In just a few weeks, Wörgl transformed. Streets once filled with idle men now echoed with the sound of construction. Broken infrastructure was repaired. Public projects that had been frozen for years were suddenly completed. Even the local morale changed. Despair gave way to purpose. For the first time in years, people felt in control of their own destiny, and all because of paper money that couldn't sit still. The results were astonishing. Within 1 year, unemployment in Wörgl dropped by nearly 25%, while the rest of Austria remained trapped in economic misery. The town paved new streets, repaired buildings, built bridges, improved sewage systems, planted trees, and even constructed a new ski jump that attracted visitors. Merchants smiled again. Children laughed in the streets. The miracle of Wörgl had begun. Soon, word spread across Europe. Journalists arrived to witness it. Economists wrote papers about it. Mayors from other towns came to learn how this strange experiment had achieved what governments couldn't. The people of Wörgl had found a way to save themselves, not through debt or charity, but through cooperation. But not everyone was pleased. The Austrian National Bank, the only institution legally allowed to issue money, grew nervous. If every small town could create its own currency, they feared the entire financial system would unravel. Wörgl. The bank demanded that the experiment be shut down immediately. Unterguggenberger pleaded his case. He explained that the money wasn't replacing the national currency. It was simply helping people survive until the real economy recovered. He offered full transparency, showing that every local note was backed by actual shillings in reserve. But the central bank didn't care. The idea that money could exist outside their control was simply unacceptable. In late 1933, after a year of extraordinary success, the Austrian Supreme Court ruled that the Wörgl currency was illegal. The town was forced to end the program. The local notes were collected and burned. Within months, unemployment returned. The project stopped. The optimism faded. The same people who had once felt free and self-reliant now had to wait again for distant politicians and bankers to decide their fate. The miracle was over, but the lesson endured. Economists who studied the Wörgl experiment found that the concept worked exactly as intended. By increasing the velocity of money, the speed at which it changes hands, the town had reignited its own economy. What failed was not the system, but the willingness of higher powers to let it live. And that's the moral heart of this story. Wörgl reminds us that money is not wealth. People are. Real value doesn't come from coins, notes, or digital numbers. It comes from human creativity, labor, and trust. When fear paralyzes a nation, it's often small communities, not massive institutions, that rediscover how to move forward. Unterguggenberger's courage wasn't about defying the law. It was about defending life, reminding people that even in a broken system, we can still build, trade, and care for each other. He once said, "Our problem is not work. Our problem is money standing still." That single sentence could describe every financial crisis before and since. Today, nearly a century later, the same lesson echoes through our world. We have global currencies, digital banks, and economies measured in trillions, yet people still feel powerless, disconnected, and afraid. We chase money as if it were the goal itself, forgetting that its true purpose is to enable creation, not control. When Wörgl's money flowed, life flourished. When it stopped, everything froze again. So perhaps the deeper message is this: the economy is not a machine. It's a reflection of how we treat one another. When trust dies, so does trade. When fear takes over, progress stops. But when communities rediscover cooperation, miracles can happen, even in the darkest times. Imagine if, instead of waiting for solutions from the top, people everywhere acted like the citizens of Wörgl, working together, inventing, and keeping hope alive. It wasn't the printed paper that saved them. It was their decision to believe again in their own ability to create value. And that is what makes the story timeless. Because the truth is, every generation faces its own kind of Great Depression. Moments when systems fail, when money loses meaning, when ordinary people feel small and powerless. But history shows that power never disappears. It only waits for those brave enough to use it. The people of Wörgl didn't ask permission to hope. They built it, one stamped note at a time. Their experiment lasted only 13 months, but its echo has lasted for nearly a century. A whisper that says, the power to rebuild doesn't come from banks or politicians. It comes from belief, trust, and action. Money may change from gold to paper to pixels, but the human heart behind it remains the same. We create value together, or we lose it together. So the next time the world tells you that the system is too broken to fix, remember Wörgl. Remember a small town that turned fear into courage and paper into purpose. Remember that in the darkest moment of the Great Depression, salvation didn't come from the top. It came from a handful of ordinary people who chose to believe in each other. That's the real forgotten currency, not the stamped paper. But the faith that people, when united, can rebuild anything. Because wealth isn't what we keep, it's what we share. And sometimes, to save an economy, all it takes is a community willing to remind the world that money only matters when it moves.